Before we get into the benchmarks, here's a little bit on this PC. I was asked to build a gaming PC for my brother's chick's son. First thing I asked her was what games he was planning on playing and what else was he going to do with the PC aside from typical browsing and homework. The list of games I was given were Apex, COD, Rainbow Six Siege, and Valorant, and that he also wanted to do some video editing. I gave her a couple of options, the first prioritizing budget, which was with an i5-3470, yeah, that's pretty dated, and let her know that it would handle what her son wanted, but although it would cost less, it would be much less value for the money. One of the main reasons being the upgrade path was pretty limited by the old Intel platform. So when the time came to upgrade, which would come sooner, it would cost more to upgrade, as that would mean upgrading the CPU, motherboard, and the memory, most likely. So she went with the second platform I offered her, which was a Ryzen build. With this build, I also gave her a couple of options. As far as storage went, she could get it with a 128 gig Crucial SSD for Windows, which is pretty old, along with a 500 gigabyte hard disk drive. Or B, she could go with a 2.5 inch 240 gig Samsung Pro SSD and a 1 terabyte hard drive. Given that she mentioned COD as one of the games, I let her know that alone takes approximately 200 gigs. But looking back on that now, that may have been unintentionally misleading, as I didn't know that was for the campaign mode and did not know if NPCG, aka New PC Gamer, aka her son, was only going to play Battle Royale mode or both. Either way, she thought about it and went with option B. So the final system is as follows. Our CPU is a Ryzen 5 1600 I picked up for $40 a few months back. GPU is an MSI Armor RX 580 4 gig I got for $90. We have 16 gigs of DDR4 3000 MHz RAM by Team with RGB lighting on it, and it's all powered by a 500 watt LEPA PSU, which was given to me in an unknown condition when I purchased a bunch of other stuff from some dude. Originally, when I quoted her the price of $415, I think it was, I had it paired with an Antec 600 watt PSU, but that ended up having a coil whine, which wasn't really that loud, but this is his first gaming PC, so I wanted him to have as smooth an experience as I could offer given the components I had. And I did let her know that I swapped out the PSU for a slightly less powerful one, but to make up for the cost I threw in a Windows key. Now moving on, the motherboard is a Gigabyte A320 board, one of if not the cheapest they have at Micro Center, which is where I picked it up. It only has 2 slots for RAM, and one of the SATA slots gets covered by the lengthy PSU. But bitch. I think having an M.2 NVMe kinda makes up for it. In my experience, there is a noticeable difference going from a approximately 500 meg read speed 2.5 inch SSD to a 1.5 gig plus read speed drive. Not just in fully booting up, i.e. having all startup programs start up fully, but in overall system responsiveness. Now for the case, I used a DIY PC P48-W. This was my second time building in this case, so I knew it was going to be a pretty tight fit going in. So tight, in fact, I needed to plug in the 8-pin GPU power cable before sliding the GPU into the PCIe slot. Otherwise, I wouldn't have enough clearance to plug the cable in. On the bright side, this allowed me to tie the GPU cable to the case, which virtually eliminated GPU sag. Building this took me longer than I had hoped since the parts were scattered throughout different systems, and I'm sure I could have gotten $100 more if I built it and posted it for sale on one of the various marketplaces, but it was really no biggie since it was for a relatively close repeat customer. As usual, these benches are quick and dirty, so just keep that in mind. The gameplay you see here does not correspond to the scores that are up on screen. Couple of reasons, one of them being I recorded this with the Radeon Relive software, and I ran the benches without the recording software on, as it does impact performance a bit. I just realized I lost my benchmarks, some of them. Seems I only have the results for Valorant and COD. So let's start with COD then. I did bench this game with training rather than an actual game, just for consistency's sake. Starting off with 1080p, most settings turned up, including texture, although no anti-aliasing. We see some respectable results, coming in at a 97 average frame rate, 1% and 0.1% lows of 76.5 and 65.3 FPS respectively. If you want a rock solid, buttery smooth experience, then having a 0.1% low of over 60 FPS will give you that, with few exceptions, as computers are just weird with anomalies like that sometimes. Now, staying with 1080 but bumping the texture setting down, we see our average shoot up to just over 100 FPS, 1% low to 83.1 and 0.1% low to 71.2. At this point, I realized I had not checked the shadow settings. They were set to their default medium or whatever it was, so I decided to lower that as well and just keep it low for the rest of the benchmark. At 1080, this didn't show as significant a difference as I thought it would, with our average going from 105 to 107 FPS. And our 1% going from 83 to 86 and 0.1% going from 71 to 74. So around a 3 FPS increase across the board. Even though it didn't impact performance too much, I decided to leave this low because I don't care too much about shadows. At least not in a game like this, where it's more about gameplay and not atmosphere. Now moving on to 1440p with low settings, we see an average frame rate of 85.3, 1% low of 68.6 and 0.1% low of 61.3. So we're getting pretty close to going under that 60 FPS threshold for that 0.1% low. Not that going under 60 FPS for your 0.1% is going to have a disastrous result or anything like that, but you know, it's all a matter of preference. Staying at 1440 but bumping the settings to high, we see the biggest difference in 0.1% lows within a given resolution. Cut to below half at 28.6 FPS. A 30 plus frame drop. 30 FPS, man. And that was once all I knew. And I didn't even know it at the time. Until my first taste of that sweet, sweet 60. When I played the original Gran Turismo on PS1, and you were able to play those special levels that had some of the assets removed in order to make it run at 60. That was pretty awesome. It was like listening to the Beatles for the first time. But yeah, anyway, 1440 high settings. The 1% did not take as big a dip as the 0.1%, sitting at 55.7 FPS, with our average frame rate at 72.3. Still playable, and I might even leave it at these settings if I were playing the campaign and it performed similarly, but I would definitely turn the settings down to get more FPS if I were playing online with other people. Now, moving on to 4K, it wasn't terrible, it was still pretty playable actually, but it was nothing to brag about. Not that I've actually ever met anyone that brags about their FPS. At 4K low, we see an average of 44.3, 1% low of 36.9 and 0.1% low of 32.3, which shows a smaller difference from the average and the 1% and 0.1% lows compared to the previous resolutions. Personally, I wouldn't run this resolution for playing online at all, but it might still be alright playing on a big screen TV, especially if said TV does motion smoothing and does it very well. Now bumping up to high settings, staying on 4K, we see an average of 39, 1% low of 30.3 and 0.1% low of 25.3. Playable still? Yeah, I guess. I wouldn't really recommend it though, but maybe you can lock the frame rate to 24 or something and have it still look good if you have one of those motion smoothing TVs. Here's a chart recapping performance for all resolutions. On the left we have low settings performance, and the right has high or near max settings performance, albeit with shadows kept low. We have the vertical axis divided into segments of 30 FPS. Looking at 1080p, which is blue, we managed to stay above 60 FPS across the board. Blue, you're my boy! With 1440 not too far behind, at least on low settings, as it also managed to stay above 60. It only dipped below 60 once we get into the percentile lows on high settings. Wrapping it up with 4K, we get closer to 30 than 60 no matter what the setting. The footage you are about to see for Apex Legends is not from the benchmarked machine. The audio, however, was recorded while benchmarking. No RGB was harmed during the process. Apex Legends with everything maxed out was running well over 60 FPS. This is in the training. with adaptive resolution turned off completely. Also with adaptive super sampling off. I just turned it back on to see how it does. So it's hitting 100 FPS now, which is the target. I couldn't put it any higher than that. And it does look a little lower res. And it actually looks like it's kind of stuttering here and there. Yeah, so I think I would leave it off if I were to play. And I am going to leave it off for the rest of these benches. Now moving on to low settings, 1080p. Why don't these games have a default for overall settings? You know, you tick low, it takes everything to low. You tick high, it takes everything to high. I think Valorant was like that too, if I'm not mistaken. So Apex at 1080p, low settings runs pretty well, at least in this area. 120 frames plus, so 1440p. Low settings seems to be getting a consistent 80 plus FPS. Oh no, it does take dips into the 70s. Throwing a grenade around. I just switched the settings too high. It's still on 1440p and it is now sitting at 50 FPS. Womp womp. Took a dip into 48 right there. I'm not benching this, I'm just checking it out real quick. 1800p, sitting at high 30 FPS. It's kind of nauseating looking at this. Okay, 1800p going from high to low, sitting at 60 FPS. It's not nauseating. Looks pretty smooth too. Little dip to 50 and probably below, maybe even lower when there's a lot of action going on. But this is quite playable. Now I'm moving on to 4K. This is with low settings. I'm not even gonna bother putting it at high settings because it's gonna make me sick. Seems better than 1800p at high. Becomes nauseating here and there, but for the most part it's 40 FPS, mid 30 sometimes. It's still playable. So far then, Valorant is the best performing game. Valorant at 1080p at max settings runs very well. It's so well, in fact, I'm not going to bother to test the lower setting for 1080p. I'm just going to go straight to the other resolutions. 120 FPS, as I said, it's running very well. 1080p max settings, and it shoots up once you get indoors. If you have a 240 Hz 1080p display, this is gonna utilize it fully in some areas. I said I wasn't gonna test it at lower settings, but just to see what the low is in that same starting area, and it's sitting at 180 something, so it's better, but it will not max out it will not fully utilize a 240 Hz display at all times. Maybe at 720p, but who wants to play at that resolution? 1440p high settings looks, at least in the beginning, just as good as 1080. Frame rate wise, it's in the 120s, which is surprising. GPU usage is nearly maxed out here and there, goes up and down. CPU 40% is hitting over 240. 1440p low settings, beginning area 160 plus, 170, 180 FPS, 160 to 180 plus. Switching over to 4K, 160 FPS. Looks way better now too. I'm guessing what, maybe like a 40% decrease in performance on average when the action is really going. That's just a wild guess on my part. Okay, 4K high, we finally see a pretty significant performance drop. It is now sitting at 100 FPS in the beginning, so you know, still great for a 75 Hz display. We're hitting 130 FPS indoors, good for a 120 Hz display. So at 4K, if gaming online is not too far off from this, and this game performs very well enough to fully utilize a 4K 120 Hz display at some points. Resident Evil, I'm indoors, 4K mixed settings. I turn shadows low, but it's getting around 40 FPS. See, it took a dip to about 28, but still no biggie. This is very playable at 4K. You can even probably turn VSync on and lock it to 30. Initially with 4K, what I did was just keep messing with the settings until I got it to near the maximum VRAM. Now I'm gonna turn everything down completely. Always leaving shadows off though, even when everything else is maxed out. So we are now hitting over 60 FPS on 4K. Just turned everything down that I possibly could. So yeah, this game, you can do it at 4K. I mean, I am in this room, but at its worst, I don't expect it to be that bad or to be lasting that long, you know? The footage you see on screen now is from 1080p, I believe, but I have no idea at what settings. Sorry about that. At least looking at these numbers, you know you can hit over 100 at some resolution under 4K. This was my first time playing Doom Eternal. I did play a little bit of the 2016 one, but never finished it. This one looks way more awesome. I couldn't test all of the presets. Anything above high was blocked off completely for 1080p and above. And I could no longer go high at 1440p and no longer go medium at 4K. It's not like that other game where it was applying the setting anyway, even though the projected VRAM usage was over the physical VRAM. In any case, the game ran very, very well at all of the settings I tested, and I would even go so far as to play this at 4K if you want to have it on a big screen TV. For Assassin's Creed, the footage of the main character just standing in the middle of the screen was recorded separately on my main machine. The rest corresponds to the benchmark. So Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a game that lets you max out the settings even though it exceeds the VRAM usage. What's going on? I'm just gonna run the built-in benchmark. 4K Super Ultra Max settings, 7 FPS. Wow, this is terrible. It's now at 5 FPS with Radeon Relive recording. Okay, I guess I'll try the max 4K settings that keeps it under the VRAM limit. And that turns out to be the high preset. And this game takes so long to start up and restart over and over, even though it is on an SSD. Just checking for additional content business really takes up a lot of time at startup. Okay, so it's kind of playable now. 20 FPS. Almost barely playable. Getting crappier by the second. Enough of that setting, let's lower it down to its lowest and then go down from there. Checking for additional content again, even though I just left the benchmark. What the hell? Setting the graphical quality at low brings it down from near its max of 4 gigs on the VRAM usage to 2.5. This game really kind of sucks to benchmark. Every time you change a graphical preset, the overall preset, you have to restart the game. Wait for that additional content BS. Whoops, not only did my game restart, my PC restarted. So running the built-in benchmark, it's getting above 30 now. 30 to 40. I'm gonna let this one run all the way through. For a game like this, 30 FPS is still very enjoyable. Especially if you have one of those TVs that has that motion smoothing and does it very well. I played through Final Fantasy VII like that with a TV that did it very well, and it was very, very nice. I imagine that's what it would be like to play it on a PS4 Pro. I'm not gonna say it was perfect. There'd be some odd pixelation here and there, but it wasn't too bothersome or distracting. Anyway, I think I'm just gonna do 1440 low and 1080p low because it's kind of frustrating waiting for this to boot up over and over.
It's frustrating. It's frustrating. It's frustrating. It's frustrating.
Interesting, I just found out if you only change the resolution and none of the graphical settings, you do not have to restart the game. 1440p low. Started off at 70 indoors, but it is now at 55, 53, 52. Almost 60 FPS, not quite, and I did see a hiccup here and there, so the 0.1% lows might not be great. 1440p, 60 FPS rock solid is not attainable, but it's pretty damn close, and it's close enough. Now moving on to 1080p.
And Blue!
Low settings.
Yes, do you trust that I do not want to see you die here tonight?
Sir, yes, sir.
Starting off at 70 FPS again. Dipping below 60, but it's staying closer to 60 than 50. It's at 55, 57. Dang. Even 1080p won't give you a rock solid 60 FPS. 1080p built-in benchmark got us a 62 FPS average. That's it for this one. Take care and be safe.